Hi, my name is Alex McGowin, and I'm your host again for Talking Expat Taxes. Are you interested in moving to Mexico, or maybe you're already there and you're wondering how that affects your U.S. taxes, or what is the tax implication of spending time in Mexico or moving there? Well, today's podcast is specifically for you and for that situation. We're going to be talking with Juan Antonio. He specializes and has been doing it for a long time in individuals that are moving to Mexico from somewhere else. Obviously does other things too with businesses and local individuals, but he's been working in the mobility sector for a long time. So he's going to be able to give us his insight on practical things. If you move to Mexico, when do you have to start filing a tax return, if ever? What income is subject to tax, and what are the procedures for making sure you're doing it correctly? I can fill in some gaps on how that impacts the U.S. side of your obligations on the U.S. to make sure you're not paying too much tax in one jurisdiction. It really comes down to making sure you're paying tax to the right jurisdiction and not overpaying tax in one place or the other. And if we can get away with legally paying a little less tax, then obviously we'll help you find a way to get there. But yeah. So what we're going to talk about is a lot of the practical stuff with filing requirements, residency. What does it mean to own real estate in Mexico? And how does that affect your taxes? So yeah, really looking forward to it. Juan's going to give us some good stuff. If you haven't listened to this podcast before, again, my name's Alex McGowin. I'm the owner of McGowin Tax LLC, where we help international individuals with their U.S. tax compliance and consulting. You can find me at my website, McGowanTax.com, or email me at alex.mcgowan@mcgowantax.com. But enough of all that. Let's jump into the podcast and talk to Juan. Enjoy. Hey, Juan, good to see you again, and hope you're doing well. Thanks for being here. Um, yeah, Juan is, one of the leaders in Mexico for, global mobility taxation, has his own firm, and coming onto our podcast today to give us a little background on tax residency in Mexico. So, hey, Juan, how's it going?
Hello, Lex. Nice to see you again.
Yep. Yeah, good to see you again. Hope everything's going well. Hope the tax world in Mexico is treating you well,
As always, just as the same as the US
as always.
tax issues. It's always
Right.
basically the same in most
Right.
of the cases. Hmm.
Understood. Well, yeah, Juan, maybe if you could just to start, give us a little background, into, a little background on you, what you do, what your firm does, and what y'all specialize in.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Basically, I'm the partner in IPATI Consultores. We are specialized in providing tax, legal, labor, and social security uh, assistance to employees, to foreign employees coming to work to Mexico, as well as Mexican employees transferred to work abroad.
Right.
And in my case, I have 24 years of experience in global mobility issues.
Right. Yeah, you're a former PwC guy, just like me,
Yeah,
right? In Mexico City, right?
and I was in the office of Mexico City. I was working there for about 16 years. A very nice experience.
Yeah,
Mhm.
understood. Yeah, so yeah, I thought today we could talk a little bit about on the individual side. A lot of what I deal with in my client base is, Americans, US people, um, either with flexible employment related situations to where they can, move abroad and they move to Mexico with a US employer, or they're self-employed and move to Mexico somewhere. A lot of the questions I get, I mean, obviously I get the questions on the US side, and we have to deal with the worldwide taxation situation for citizens. But in Mexico, most people, or most Americans at least, don't know where that line is in Mexico of, when do you have to start filing in Mexico, and what do you have to include at that point. So maybe if you give us a little background on when are you considered a Mexican tax resident, and what does that mean exactly once you become that?
Yeah, very good question because we have bunch of information in internet, in Facebook, in YouTube, and as many videos that we see, the more quantity of questions are arisen. Basically, um, in Mexico, we have two options to be taxed as a resident or as a non-resident. It is very important to consider that when a foreign individual comes to Mexico, one of the first questions when you will be working in Mexico is to know if you will be obligated to remit to pay taxes in Mexico, basically. When we cross the line, basically when you establish a home in Mexico, um, a dwelling, yeah, it is the first requirement stated in the Mexican tax code. If you establish a home in Mexico, you will start a tax residency treatment from a Mexican point of view.
Okay. Because I think one of the, and maybe we'll drill down into that a little bit, but one of the misconceptions that I think a lot of people have is the 183-day rule, that a lot of people are familiar with that in the US for state taxation, crossing that 183 days
Mhm.
triggers state tax residency. And a lot of foreign countries or non-US countries have that same rule. And that is a rule in Mexico, right? It's just that they added an additional rule related to the
Yeah,
home
uh, and
concept.
this misunderstanding actually this misunderstanding is still uh, alive in Mexico. This rule of the 183 day was in the Mexican income tax law. I think that in 2004, the Mexican tax law was changed.
Hmm.
So now the rule since then is that the tax code, the rule of or how do we determine Mexican tax residency is stated in the Mexican tax code. And and since then, the rule is that if you establish a home in Mexico, you will be starting as your treatment as a tax resident. Mexico will not look to the past; they will look to the future. I mean, if you stay at home in Mexico in June 20th,
Hmm.
you will be treated as a Mexican tax resident from now till the end of the year.
Okay. I understood. It doesn't go backwards. So when
Correct.
you say establish a home or a dwelling in Mexico, so if you, I mean, in that case, if you came and established a home on December 30th, you'd be, even though you only spent 2 days in Mexico for the year, you would have, or you'd be a resident for 2 days because of that rule.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's on the law. It's you are okay. You are right.
Okay.
It
Right.
could have some practical problems, but for
Right.
2 days, but you
Right.
are okay. You are right. Hmm.
Yeah. And that's always the, I don't know if the calling it a game is the right way to phrase it, but I mean, what we're talking about here is really the technical rule, and then there's kind of the practical application of those technical rules for sure. Like if you move on
Correct.
December 31st and you have a home there December 31st, technically you have a tax residency in Mexico, but practically, who's going to actually file a tax return for 1 day of tax residency, and how would you even determine what income would be allocated to it? So I agree, there'd be some practical issues there. But I guess going back to that home concept, is it like, because a lot of times in the US we have terms like that are very poorly defined, if not at all, and we have to look at case law and figure out what that means. I mean, clearly a home, if you purchased a home and moved into it with your family, I think that would clearly be a definition of, establishing a home in Mexico. But
Hmm.
what if you're a single person and you have a short-term lease or an Airbnb, in this world, like a short-term rental agreement in Mexico, and you stay there for the rest of the year. If you moved today in June and you just kind of went to short-term rentals for the rest of the year, Um, is it, I guess, what is the line for for a home in Mexico, or is it a blurry line?
It is that the home or the house that you are living in is basically to your 100% your disposal. I mean,
Ah, so
if
if you're
if you
renting, then oh, at your disposal. I see what you're saying. So if you're renting it, it's 100% at your disposal.
correct, if
Um,
you are renting, if you buy the house, if
yeah.
you are renting, if you pay the rent, or if of the company that sent you to work to Mexico is paying the rent on your behalf. Basically, if you have the home to your disposal, that's in Mexico, the concept is casa habitación.
Okay.
Then, if it is on your disposal, is the casa habitación. If you are in a hotel, it means that you will be in Mexico for a short period of time. Or if you are, I mean, if you are in Mexico 2 weeks, staying in a hotel, you go back to the US and you return to Mexico, you will be maybe in another hotel or in the same hotel or in another room.
Hmm. I
In
see.
in that case, it's not considered as a casa habitación.
Right. I,
And
I guess these short-term rental places like an Airbnb or a VRBO, that confuses that rule a little bit, right? Because technically, they have that house at their disposal, but it may just be for a short-term period of time, in which case they're probably okay to not call that a home. It's more these like lease agreements, like if you have a 6 month or a year lease, certainly if you purchase a home and you live there. Um, yeah.
yeah, and also we should consider in the case of the an Airbnb, if you come for a short time, let's say that if you come for a month, you go back to the US and you return to Mexico and you come and you return to another house, or
Right.
then it will not be considered as a casa habitación. But if you come to Mexico and you are renting a home in Airbnb for a long period of time,
Hmm.
it could be reviewed if this will be your casa habitación.
I see. So it really comes down to long term versus short term at the end of the day, it sounds like. I mean, maybe there's not a specific number of months or weeks that you have to rent it, but subjectively purchasing a house or a medium to long term lease agreement would be a casa habitación, as
Mhm.
opposed to a shorter term rental where in the same year you may be at different shorter term rentals, in which case you wouldn't have established that home concept. And so in that case, you're probably still a non-resident. So in
Mhm.
that situation, let's say you don't cross that line to be a resident, but you are spending, let's say you have a couple of Airbnb months that you spend in Mexico and work remotely from those places. Um, so you're a non-resident, but working in Mexico for a foreign company or maybe for your own company. Uh,
Mhm.
what are your technical filing obligations in Mexico, if any? And I guess we can talk about the practical side of that as well.
Okay, we should take care of some other concepts related to the how we determine the tax residency in Mexico.
Hmm.
If you do not establish a home in Mexico because you have another home in the US, we should review where is your vital center, your center of vital interest. It means where you will be earning or receiving more than 50% of your annual income
Hmm.
in a calendar year, I mean. And if in Mexico is established your principal center of professional activities.
Right.
We also, if you say, okay, I mean, I have 50% of my income earned in Mexico and 50% of my income receive in the US, then where is your main center of activities? It could be in your example, your in question, it could be Mexico because you are rendering the services in Mexico.
Right.
We should be clear also the concept of source of income. For instance, if you are working in the US, you will be considered as that your income is US income,
Right.
US source income.
That's where you're
If you are
physically providing the services. Right.
if you are working in Mexico, then it will be considered as Mexican source income.
Mm-hmm.
For example, in the case of the of real property, or in the case of rental income, if the house is in Mexico, it will be considered the income as Mexican source.
Mm.
It,
Right.
it does not matter if you are paid in the US. If you work in Mexico, it will be considered Mexican source income. It does not matter if the US company is paying or if the money is deposited in your US bank account or in another country.
Right. So if you're
In,
providing services, the source of the income is where you're physically providing it. Doesn't matter who the payor of those services are and where they're paying from or where the bank account is. So I,
correct,
so yeah, this is a good point. And I think one thing we've left out at this point, and maybe you're about to get to that, but is the tax treaty between the US and Mexico, right? Is that
correct,
we have the technical rules of what is considered a Mexican tax resident. We talked about the tax home in Mexico triggering residency, but then our fallback is the treaty between the U.S. and Mexico, which has its own test for breaking residency. I mean, it's
mhm,
called the treaty tiebreaker test. And it's basically what you
mhm,
just mentioned. I mean, it goes down a list of specific requirements to see which way you break to Mexico or to the US. So even if you fall under the Mexican tax residency rule, we can still look to the treaty to say, all right, where are you actually a resident under the treaty? And like you
correct,
said, center of vital economic interests is a big one, and you may break back to the US, even though the technical rule in Mexico is that you're a resident under the law. So
correct.
we have some options to keep you as a resident, a non-resident of Mexico, even if you're, you know, technically breaking over that under the Mexican law perspective.
Yeah, and it is important to consider that in your example, if an employee or if an individual is working in Mexico,
Mhm.
you 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 have to consider that the income is Mexican source.
Right,
This is the first point. The second point is to know you will be taxed as a resident or as a non-resident, or you will be taxed.
right, right.
Yeah,
So
and
how,
then
in that case, how would a non-resident be taxed? Let's say you are a non-resident, either because of the treaty or because you didn't meet the home test in Mexico. How is a non-resident tax based on Mexican sourced income? So providing services in Mexico.
okay, it's interesting because in the Mexican income tax law is divided in chapters.
Mhm.
We have a chapter or titles. The titles is we have a title for residents and a title for non-residents. In the specific case of an employee, the income tax rates will be different than the taxes the rates applied to a resident. It will be lower. In the specific case of salaries, if you receive other kinds of income as interest, dividends, rental income, capital gains, in most of the cases, you will be obligated to pay a 25% of income tax rate
On
flat
Mexican source income, right?
on the gross income.
But it has to be Mexican sourced in the
Correct.
non-resident scenario. Right.
Mhm.
So if you're a non-resident of Mexico and you get a dividend from a U.S. company, that's not going to be taxable in Mexico.
Correct.
But if it's a
Um,
Mexican company or yeah, it's back to the sourcing rule. Like you said, you have to go through it in phases. Are you resident or non-resident? And then is the income sourced to Mexico? And if it is, as a non-resident, you have to pick up Mexican sourced income, which is really the same rule as in the US. Um,
okay. Mhm.
same concept. Yeah, there's varying levels of people following that rule. Like for example, if a Mexican comes to the US and they're not a US citizen or green card holder, and they spend 10 days working in the US and earn over a certain amount of money, um, the technically that's US sourced income that could be, taxable in the US. But actually the treaty drills down on that under specific articles of the treaty that would exempt that individual from having to pay tax on that U.S. sourced income, which I think could be the same in Mexico in a non-resident perspective. That we could fall back on the treaty potentially to help us out with service-based income for a short-term period. And we have to look at the specific treaty article. We can't quote
Mhm.
that here off the top of our heads, but
Yeah.
uh,
Mhm.
but yeah, I mean, I think that's the progression, right? That's how I think about it as a progression. It's does the law call you a resident or non-resident? If you're a non-resident, do you have any Mexican source income? If you do, technically you're going to need to pick that up and pay tax on it. But then the next rule is, can you get any help from the tax treaty? And in a lot of cases, you can. So I think that's kind of the progression I go through, if you agree with that concept.
Correct. And in the case of salaries, it's also interesting because you could be taxed in a 0%, 15%, or 30%. Basically, we have some brackets of income,
Mhm.
and depending of the amount of income that you are receiving as an employee, I'm talking about salary, you could be taxed on a 0%, 15%, or 30%.
Right. Yeah, what we call marginal tax rates. So depending on your income, there's a progressive rate structure where the rate grows depending on how much income you have.
Yeah, and it is important to consider you that you could be paying taxes in Mexico as a non-resident. You should be provided by a certificate of the taxes paid in Mexico, and these taxes should be considered as a foreign tax credit, for instance, in the US.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that we have ways to, for sure. I mean, the first step is making sure we're paying tax to the right country. And then the US decides to make everything difficult by not really caring what the residency rules say, and they
Mhm.
just tax you anyway because you're a
Mhm.
citizen. Regardless of where you're actually a resident, they tax you anyway. So yeah, and we have mechanisms here in the US like the foreign tax credit to make sure you're at least not getting paid taxed twice on the same income. Um, yeah,
And if you consider it's strange, let's say less strange because sometimes you can hear, hey, you should not pay taxes in Mexico because you're a foreign individual.
right,
Wrong. Sometimes, as a foreign employee, you come to Mexico to work, and sometimes the misunderstanding is thinking that you should not be obligated to remit taxes in your home country,
right.
which could be wrong. I don't know if you are agree, but in most of the cases, you will be filing, or you will be filing a return in the U.S. as well as in Mexico. That's why we have the tax treaty in order to avoid double taxation using the process of the foreign tax credit.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, I agree. And that actually made me think of another question, and this may be a hard one to answer, so feel free to tell me if you don't really know for sure. But I mean, what is the practical risk to somebody like an American that say they go down to Mexico for half a year or a year and work remotely? Um, Depending on their visa restrictions, that's always a question too. But let's say they go down there and they work remotely for a company or for themselves down in Mexico, and they have, and technically they have tripped a taxation requirement in Mexico. But I mean, how practical, like what is the real risk to them from the concept of the Mexican IRS? They're going to have their own name that I've forgotten, but uh, you know, how aggressive are they? I guess is the question for people like that. And what is the kind of the practical risk there for people just not filing tax returns in Mexico when they should?
Okay, we could have the situation when the employee, as I understood, is working in Mexico, and then in order to be allowed to work in Mexico, the employee should get a Mexican visa.
Right.
If you obtain your Mexican visa, you maybe in the future you would like to have a Mexican bank account.
Hmm.
If you transfer money to Mexico, it could you could open the Pandora's box.
I see. See, that's one difference. Like in the U.S., at least in my experience, the immigration rules and the IRS and the immigration rules, they don't really talk to each other. So, I mean, if you come to the US and you're on a work visa, that doesn't necessarily
Mm.
tell the IRS to, hey, look out for a tax return for this guy because he's on a work visa. But I agree with you, it is the same thing. If you start opening bank accounts and earn interest, that gets reported to the IRS, and then they're going to start looking for tax returns. So it sounds like it's similar in Mexico to where, sure, if you move to Mexico and you open no bank account, you're on a temporary visa and you're just flying under the radar completely. I mean, yes, technically there's probably little risk there if you're able to pull that off like the James Bond of tax. But
Yeah,
but in the practical world, if you stay there long enough, you're gonna need a real visa that gives you working rights. You might want to open a bank account there, and that's when, you know, now they know who you are and they're going to start
yeah,
expecting, and they're going to know income that you earn. So that's really where that line crosses a little bit, I guess.
yeah. And I have cases in which the individual came to Mexico, and at the beginning he thought, well, nobody knows that I'm working here, but in he had the need to open a bank account. He
Mhm.
knew that investments in Mexico are paying an interesting interest rate. Then he started transferring money down to Mexico.
Right,
Then is when we told him, well, you are opening a gate.
right. Understood. Okay, well, honestly, I think we may leave it at that. That's a good place to stop, I think, to understand, the risks associated with not filing correctly in Mexico. But I mean, just to summarize, I mean, Mexican tax residency can get triggered when you have a home in Mexico. And that home, an easy way to think about it would be based on it being a long-term situation, long-term lease, long-term home. Temporary things where you could be at different places during a single year probably aren't going to trip that. Um, but then once you do trip that, or even if you don't, and you're a non-resident and you have Mexican source income, you need to look at the US Mexican treaty. And really at that point, it's worth talking to a professional that has experience looking at the treaty documents because it's not written in normal English or Spanish, depending on your language, but it's its own language, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. This session is just educational, because it's not a session of a tax advice, and it is important to consider that this as tax assistance should be in a case by case basis, because uh, probably in your experience, maybe you could have or you could think that you have two individuals with the same cases. They are the same age, they are a similar job, they are earning basically the same amount of money, uh, but in a point, we have a breaking point. One of them could be married, the other could be single. Um, One of them should have a home in Mexico as well as in the US. The other one maybe only has a Mexican home. And then when you think that you are talking about the same situation, in most of the cases, the tax treatment will be changing.
Right. Yeah, our favorite answer, right? It depends. It depends on
It
the
depends.
it depends
It
on the
depends.
facts of the situation at the end of the day.
Yeah.
All right, Juan, this is really good information. Appreciate you coming on, giving us some insight into these residency rules. Yeah, look forward to having you back on in the future and we can talk about some other Mexican tax stuff. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, have a great day. Talk to you later.
You too. Bye now.